The chandeliers of St. Philip's Hall glowed with a golden light, polished oak floors gleaming beneath the dancers' steps. I had attended weddings in Charleston before, but none carried the weight of this one. My only daughter, Livia, radiant in lace, standing at the center of a room filled with 160 guests. For most of the evening, I stayed near the edges, smiling politely, letting her have the stage she had always craved. The music shifted, and a hush rolled through the crowd when Livia approached me. At first, her smile was fixed, polite, the kind brides practice for photographs. Then her eyes sharpened, and her words came like a blade. "Mother, give me the keys to your harbor apartment. Now." The request wasn't new. She had hinted before, pressed me with suggestions about downsizing, but never here, never in front of so many. I felt the stares prickling my back. The curiosity of Charleston society trained on me like searchlights. "No," I said, quietly but firmly. My voice did not carry across the hall, but it carried enough. The sound of her hand was sharper than any music. My glasses flew from my face, clattering on the floor, one lens shattering across the polished wood. For a moment there was nothing. No orchestra. No laughter. Only the stillness of people frozen mid-breath. My cheeks stung, but the ache in my chest burned deeper. I crouched, fumbling for the broken pieces. Not a hand moved to help me. Some guests turned their eyes away, embarrassed. Others whispered behind napkins. My son-in-law shifted awkwardly beside her, but said nothing. My daughter smoothed the folds of her gown as if nothing had happened. "You don't need that space anymore," she announced. "Ethan and I will make better use of it." Her voice rang through the hall, dripping with finality. I rose slowly, my hand trembling as I held the bent frame of my glasses. I had been silent through so many small indignities, but this moment carved a line that could not be crossed again. Without another word, I walked through the crowd, the weight of 160 eyes following me. In the quiet of the entrance hall, I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered only a moment before I pressed Marcus's number, my voice steady when he answered. "Bring the documents," I said. And then I stepped into the night, knowing nothing would ever return to the way it had been. After leaving the hall, the night air cooled my burning cheek, but memory brought its own kind of heat. I had walked a long road to arrive at that slap, paved with sacrifices no one in that ballroom had ever seen. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, Livia was barely 12. Bills stacked like bricks on the kitchen counter of our Charleston apartment. And I was left to build a life from what little remained. I took extra shifts at the public library, shelving until my hands ached, running literacy programs for children, anything that added a few more dollars to our account. Some nights I skipped dinner so she could have seconds. I told myself hunger was easier to bear than watching her go without. Through her high school years, I clipped coupons, wore the same 2 skirts until the hems frayed, and pawned my wedding jewelry when tuition notices from the University of South Carolina arrived. Each check I mailed to Columbia carried a piece of myself with it. I believed that if she could walk through those campus gates debt-free, she might build a life better than the one I was patching together. For a time, gratitude flickered. She would call home with stories from her dorm, or thank me in quick embraces when she visited. But as she grew older, those moments thinned. The girl who once asked me to braid her hair before bed returned from college with sharper edges, speaking about internships, fashion, and friends with last names that opened doors. My plain cardigans and the dented Corolla embarrassed her. By the time she launched her wedding planning business, the contempt was no longer hidden. She would glance at my shoes and sigh, "Mother, don't you own anything modern?" or run her fingers along the Corolla's cracked dashboard, muttering, "This car is dangerous," not to mention depressing. Even the small joy I found working part-time at the library branch downtown became ammunition. Other women your age enjoy retirement. Why do you insist on smelling like old books? I told myself words were lighter than burdens I had already carried. But the erosion was steady, drop by drop, year by year. The lowest moment came 3 months ago when she brought a friend to visit. A man with polished shoes and a leather folio. She claimed he was just stopping by on their way to brunch. But I noticed how he paced my living room, tapping measurements into his phone. When I asked, Livia smiled too quickly. He's just curious about how you manage upkeep at your age. It was then I understood she was no longer circling the idea of taking my home. She was preparing the ground, and in that knowledge, the silence I had kept for decades began to crack, setting the stage for the choice I made the night of her wedding. I still remember the night I finally heard her say it aloud. I had stepped into the kitchen for water when Livia's voice drifted from the living room, sharp and confident in a way she never used with me. If I can get her to move, the harbor condo is ours, she told someone on the phone. Her tone was casual, as if my life could be folded into a simple real estate transaction. I froze where I stood, listening as she listed the view, the square footage, the location near the Battery, all the things I cherished for their memories, not their market value. It's perfect for us, she said. She just needs convincing. She's soft. She'll believe anything. Those words struck harder than the slap that would come later. To her, I wasn't a mother, only an obstacle between her and what she believed she deserved. Over the following weeks, the truth surfaced in fragments. I overheard whispers about debt collectors and saw the strain on Ethan's face when he thought no one was watching. Charleston is a small city. Rumors travel quickly. From a friend at the bank, I learned Livia's event business was buried under more than $120,000 of debt. The wedding itself had been built on credit cards, borrowed money, and promises that could never be kept. My apartment was not just a convenience. It was their salvation. To them, it meant cash, collateral, a way out of the hole they had dug with their vanity and ambition. To me, it was the place Robert and I had chosen for its quiet harbor view, where he had spent his last evenings talking about the future I now carried alone. I had told myself for years that her sharp words came from frustration, that her ambition made her restless. But hearing her plot to claim my home forced me to face what I had avoided. She did not see me as family anymore. She saw me as a possession, waiting to be claimed. I replaced the phone gently on its hook and sat in the darkened kitchen, understanding for the first time that the greatest betrayal was not the contempt in her voice, but the cold certainty that I no longer mattered except for the keys I carried. The parking lot was nearly empty when I sat back in the driver's seat, the broken frame of my glasses resting in my lap. My cheek still burned where her hand had struck. But inside me, another heat had begun to rise steady, focused, long overdue. I dialed Marcus, and when he answered, my voice was calm. "Bring the documents," I said. He asked nothing more, only promised he would come. Then I called Josephine Ruiz, the neighbor who had become a kind of sister through the years. "Josephine, I need you to go into my apartment, the back room, second drawer of the desk. There's a brown folder, sealed. Bring it to me." She didn't hesitate, only said, "I'll be there soon." When she placed it in my hands 20 minutes later, I thanked her quietly. She gave me a long look, the sort of look that says more than words, and left me to open it alone. Inside lay the story of my life, one I had never told my daughter. The first deed was to the old commercial building on King Street, the one Robert bought in 1984 when storefronts stood empty, and few believed the district would revive. Now it generated rents that paid more in a month than I once made in a year at the library. Next came the title to the Folly Beach house we purchased as an investment long before it became a tourist haven. Its value had tripled. Behind those papers lay the account statements, their numbers running into millions. 5 million in total, carefully diversified, hidden behind the modest life I had built to protect us. Robert always said, "Invisible wealth gives you freedom." I had lived by that creed, never drawing attention, never flaunting. But the pages that cut deepest were not the deeds or balances, they were the bank transfers. Month after month, money sent to cover Livia's rent when she was late, to erase her credit card debts, to float her business when bills piled too high. She had thought blessings fell from thin air. In truth, they came from me, her mother, who had been carrying her long after she had stopped seeing me as anything but a burden. I closed the folder and set it on the passenger seat. My reflection in the windshield sharper than it had been in years. The slap had been her attempt to end my authority. Instead, it ended my silence. Headlights swept into the lot, and Marcus stepped out, briefcase in hand. I tightened my grip on the folder, knowing we would walk back into that ballroom together. And this time, I would not bow my head. Marcus walked beside me, his stride measured, his briefcase held close as if it were a shield, the folder pressed against my ribs beneath my arm, steadying me like a heartbeat. When we pushed open the tall doors of St. Philip's Hall, the sound inside faltered. The orchestra stumbled mid-phrase, the notes scattering until silence claimed the room. 160 heads turned as though pulled by the same thread. Livia stood at the center, her gown glittering under the chandeliers, but the sparkle could not disguise the tension in her jaw. Ethan hovered at her side, already paling. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice cut through the stillness, strong and sure. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption. My name is Marcus Ellery, attorney to Mrs. Corinna Ashford. Matters of urgent importance must be addressed before this celebration can continue." Murmurs rose, the air electric. I saw the first phones lift, guests angling for a better view. Charleston society thrived on spectacle, and tonight they had more than they bargained for. Livia's eyes flashed. "Mother, leave now. You've humiliated me enough." But Marcus opened his briefcase, drawing out papers stamped with notary seals, effective immediately. All financial guarantees extended by Mrs. Ashford to her daughter, Livia Ashford, and her household are revoked. This includes rental payments, ongoing credit card settlements, and the guarantee covering tonight's expenses at St. Philip's Hall. The words landed like hammer blows. Gasps rolled across the room. Ethan's shoulders sagged as though the weight of debt had suddenly pressed itself into his bones. "She's lying," Livia cried, her voice shrill against the silence. "She doesn't have a cent beyond her pension. She's nothing but a bitter old woman trying to ruin me." Marcus did not flinch. He lifted the first page. Bank records showing monthly transfers of $2,000 for rent, paid over the last 2 years. Credit card payments totaling $30,000, drawn from Mrs. Ashford's accounts. And here he placed the final paper on a table where the nearest guests leaned in the signed guarantee for this very event, amounting to $53,000. Gasps turned to open astonishment. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her mouth. Another muttered, "All this time." The glow of recording screens multiplied. I stepped forward, my voice steady, though my heart thundered. For years I gave quietly. I thought it was love to shield my daughter from consequence. But tonight, she chose to strike me down, not as a mother, but as an obstacle. That choice ends now. The room seemed to sway. Livia looked around wildly, searching for sympathy, but saw only blank faces or narrowed eyes. Even Ethan, his lips trembling, could not meet her gaze. I gathered the folder to my chest. There will be no more secrets, no more hidden rescues. Tonight, I reclaim what is mine. A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd, the atmosphere shifting from curiosity to judgment. And as Marcus closed his briefcase with a sharp snap, the manager of the hall stepped forward, ledger in hand, demanding to know how the bill would now be paid. The echo of Marcus's final words had not yet faded when a man in a dark suit threaded his way through the guests. His face was drawn tight, his ledger clutched like a weapon. I recognized him at once, the manager of St. Philip's Hall. He stopped in front of us, bowing his head briefly before addressing me in a tone that balanced courtesy with urgency. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying enough to hush the whispers around us. "I've just been informed that the guarantee for this evening's celebration has been withdrawn. The outstanding balance for the hall, catering, orchestra, and services totals $53,000. I must request immediate payment, or we will be forced to suspend the event." A murmur ran through the crowd. More guests lifting their phones, others turning toward the exits. I looked at him steadily. Then at the stack of documents Marcus had set on the table. "I will not be paying," I answered clearly. Livia let out a strangled cry, the pitch of it breaking into hysteria. "You can't do this. It's my wedding day." Her hands clutched at her gown as though she might rip it apart herself. She turned on her husband, who stood pale as plaster, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. "Ethan, do something." But Ethan only stared at the manager, lips parted, unable to speak. His bravado had dissolved under the weight of numbers he could never meet. Guests began to drift toward the doors, some with murmurs of sympathy, others with little more than curiosity. A celebration was collapsing before their eyes, and no one wished to be stranded when the lights dimmed. I felt the stillness in myself, the clarity that comes when there is no more hiding. "There will be no inheritance," I said, my voice even. Livia froze, her sobs catching in her throat. I stepped forward, not to console, but to be heard. "The will has been rewritten. Every property, every account, every asset once promised to you is redirected to the Ashford Foundation to protect seniors in this city from the exploitation of their own families." Her face drained of color, as though the floor itself had vanished beneath her. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "I already have." Silence fell heavy across the hall, broken only by the sound of another set of doors opening as more guests slipped away into the Charleston night. Livia sank onto a nearby chair, trembling hands pressed against her cheeks. Ethan stood behind her, hollow-eyed, a man who could already see the ruin ahead. I gathered the folder from the table, placed it under my arm, and looked once more across the room where so many illusions had crumbled, and I knew, as I stepped away from my daughter's shattered world, that this reckoning was only the beginning. The days that followed were strangely quiet, as if Charleston itself held its breath. Yet beneath that calm, storms gathered. Marcus arrived at my apartment one morning with a folder heavier than its weight should allow. He placed it on my table, his expression grave. "They were prepared," he said. "Your daughter and her husband filed preliminary papers weeks ago. Their plan was to petition the court, arguing you were no longer capable of managing your affairs. They wanted control of everything: bank accounts, properties, even medical decisions, all under the guise of protecting you." I sat back, letting the words settle. It was one thing to be humiliated in public, another to know they had plotted my erasure on paper long before the slap. Eleanor Ruiz, my neighbor, confirmed what my heart already suspected. She had seen them bring a man with a leather folio to our building, measuring the exterior and noting details. A real estate appraiser, she said firmly. They didn't expect anyone to notice. Her testimony was steady, born from the same nurse's composure that had guided her through years of emergencies. But even as betrayal darkened my doorstep, light came from elsewhere. The videos spread faster than I could have imagined, first through whispers of Charleston society, then across the state. Strangers wrote letters and left flowers at the library where I had worked, calling me brave. They shared clips of the slap, of Marcus's announcements, of me standing with broken glasses but an unbroken voice. For once, public judgment tilted in my favor. Marcus moved quickly, filing counterclaims that halted their petitions before they reached a judge's desk. Temporary restraining orders followed, a legal moat drawn around me. They cannot contact you directly, he explained, his tone both protective and weary. They'll have to face the truth in court, where evidence, not entitlement, decides. I looked out toward the harbor, the water steady and endless. My daughter had tried to take my home, then my name, and finally my very capacity to exist. Each attempt stripped away another layer of illusion until only the truth remained. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window, knowing the fight was not yet finished but certain I would not fight it alone. The court's decision came on a bright spring morning, months after the chaos of the wedding. The petition Livia and Ethan had filed to strip me of my competency was dismissed outright, the judge noting the evidence of their manipulation and the absurdity of their claims. Legal costs piled against them, and with their business already faltering, the weight proved too heavy. Within weeks, Livia's company shuttered. The once proud storefront that had promised Charleston's brides their perfect day now stood empty, its windows papered over. I did not celebrate her downfall. Instead, I turned toward something lasting. With Marcus's guidance, I established the Ashford Foundation for Senior Protection. What had begun as a defense of my own dignity became a shield for others in Charleston legal clinics, workshops on financial literacy, and advocates ready to step in when families blurred the line between love and exploitation. Each time I signed a check to support another case, I felt Robert's steady hand on my shoulder, his old words alive again. Invisible wealth gives you freedom. At home, peace returned in small rituals. I tended Robert's roses on the harbor balcony, pruning gently, the salt air mingling with the sweetness of their bloom. For the first time in years, I sipped my morning tea without fear of interruption, without dreading the sound of Livia's footsteps demanding more. I had not destroyed my daughter. Greed had done that long before my silence ended. What I carried forward was not bitterness, but clarity. Love without respect is not love at all, only hunger disguised. One evening, as the tide moved in and the gulls wheeled above the battery, I locked the apartment door behind me and set the keys on the table. Keys can open doors, but respect is the only inheritance no one can steal.